Hey gamers! So I'm a huge Pokemon fan, and everyone knows that no one hates Pokemon more than Pokemon fans. Modern Pokemon sucks, and I would know. I've bought every game. And every version of every game. Why? Well, I just like collecting things. Collecting is a great hobby, and I just love looking at all my games on the shelf and thinking to myself, yep, this is a good substitute for a personality. But Pokemon is special. It's a whole series about collecting, and I'm not just talking about the cute little murder monsters. Games, clothes, plushies, hell, the merchandise is actually a bigger business than the games themselves, and I'm just the right kind of sucker to buy all of it. But the king of Pokemon merch has to be the card game. There's hundreds of rare cards to collect, and the only way to get them is basically the pre-internet equivalent of the loot box. It's probably the most expensive Pokemon-related hobby you can get into, which is why, despite briefly collecting cards as a child, I'm grateful I was never dumb enough to really get into it. But was not now, and now I have a problem. It started back in December. My little brother asked for a box of cards for Christmas. I bought it for him and it sat in my bedroom for weeks. It taunted me with the nostalgia of a simpler time, when the only thing I was addicted to was, well, still Pokemon cards, but everyone was doing it back then, so that made it fine. In fact, the only real issue would be if you weren't doing it. Did you really want to be the only kid without any Pokemon cards? Sitting alone at some lunch table with some Bakugan? Me neither. So I spent every penny I could get my little kid hands on Pokemon cards. And as long as I had my holographic Charizard with me, I was never alone at that lunch table. No, there weren't any other kids with me at the lunch table, but that's not important. After all, a good Charizard card could get you enough money to afford a down payment on a one-bedroom apartment nowadays. Could you sell a child for that much? Actually, don't answer that. Anyway, fast forward to January and I was hooked all over again. I needed to pull that Arceus Altar. I needed to pull that rare Umbreon VMAX. I needed that girl with the stink foot. That one isn't rare. I just like the art. I was spending so much money on new cards I couldn't even afford to renew my Adobe subscription. The next set was right around the corner after all, but the next set is always right around the corner. They release like 5 of them a year. I realized I had to do something. I realized it was time to stop being such a helpless child, and time to go back to being a regular, semi-functional man-child. So I reached out for help, and after many hours of setbacks, trial and error, and hard work, I figured out how to pirate the Adobe suite like an adult. Now there was nothing that could get between me and my addiction. Something I noticed while collecting cards is that in addition to impressing children, you can use them to play a game with your friends as well. Unfortunately, I don't have any friends. Luckily, Nintendo has always known that half of their fan base doesn't leave their house often enough to have any real friends. So alongside the launch of the Pokemon trading card game, they've released the Pokemon trading card game video game for Nintendo Game Boy. A video game based on the card game, which is itself based on the original video game. You're this kid, the quintessential what Japan thought was cool in the 90s protagonist. You just learned about Pokemon cards 20 minutes ago and have decided to dedicate your entire life to pursuing the legendary Pokemon cards. Now I don't know what the legendary Pokemon cards are supposed to be, but I can imagine. So we politely asked the professor for the legendary God cards, and he's like, "Ha, kid, you just started this game, it's time for the tutorial." Apparently they think that kids that are big enough fans of the card game to buy the video game are slow or something, because the text in this tutorial crawls and they do not let you skip anything. And if you mess up a single instruction they give you, they make you restart your entire turn over from the beginning. Now maybe what the professor here is studying is the attention span of children or something, but as a 30-year-old from the future, I don't have to sit through this, and I'm not going to make any of you sit through it either. So here's the Cliff Notes version. Each player starts with a deck of 60 cards. Start by taking between 1 and 6 cards and setting them aside face down. These are your prize cards, little treats you get to pick up every time you knock out one of your opponent's Pokemon. Each player then gets to draw 7 cards for their starting hand and place 1 Pokemon into play as their active Pokemon. They can then place up to 5 Pokemon on their bench as backups. At the start of each turn, you draw 1 card from your deck. You can place 1 energy onto a Pokemon if you have one available, and play as many trainer cards as you wish. You end your turn by attacking your opponent. If you KO all of your opponent's Pokemon in play, or pick up all of your prize cards, you win. Now the Pokemon trading card game video game for Nintendo Game Boy includes the first 3 sets of cards released for the actual trading card game, the iconic base set, jungle set, and fossil set. As it turns out, my addiction had an upside because I had already spent this month's Adobe subscription money on buying a copy of these 3 sets for myself. And while this loser can only look at cards after he's collected them in game, I have the privilege at looking at all of them ahead of time. You're probably asking, Devin, doesn't this ruin half the point of playing the game? And to that I say, yes. And I don't care. This is my house, and in it, we cheat. I decided to make a deck based on pulling my best cards as quickly as possible. Computer Search allows you to discard 2 cards from your hand and pull any card from your deck in exchange. Bill is another great card. What does Bill do? Unplayed Bill allows you to draw 2 additional cards from your deck and add them directly into your hand. And for when my hand looks like my life prospects, disappointing, Professor Oak allows me to put my hand into the trash where it belongs. In exchange, I can draw 7 additional cards from my deck. But while these last 2 cards are pretty cool dudes, I noticed another card, a more devious card, Imposter Professor Oak, which after reading the description, I realized did the exact same thing as regular Professor Oak, but to your opponent instead. Now there's something that makes this an absolute god tier card, something that Nintendo is frankly too cowardly to tell us during the tutorial, and something that this dude on the internet called the most boring, skillless strategy that only the biggest clown-ass losers who want to ruin the game for everyone involved play with. For you see, in addition to knocking out all of your opponent's Pokemon or drawing all of your prize cards, there is a secret third win condition. If you ever have to draw a card and there's nothing left in your deck to pull, you lose automatically, giving your opponent the victory. Here's how the Imposter Professor Oak deck works. First, take all your Pokemon and put them in the trash. These animals are weak. Their power to breathe fire and crush your balls with their mind is nothing compared to the Sigma Male Mill set that this absolute chat of a man embodies. We need 4 Imposter Professor Oaks, 4 being the most copies you can have of any single card in your deck, then 4 recycles, 4 item finders, 4 bills, 4 computer searches, 4 regular Professor Oaks, and lastly, the spirit card of all Pokemon collectors, 4 gamblers. A Hail Mary card which allows us to shuffle our hand into our deck and then flip a coin. If heads, we get to draw 8 cards. If tails, we only draw 1. These 28 cards will maximize our chances of pulling, using, and then reusing our Imposter Professor Oaks, guaranteeing victory as soon as turn 1. When the game begins, each player puts aside 6 prize cards and draws 7 for their hands. After this, 47 cards are left in each player's deck. When our turn begins, we play any computer searches and bills that we have in our hands. Our goal here is to get as many Imposter Professor Oaks, recycles, and item finders into our hand as possible. If we don't have any of the cards we're looking for, and we are okay losing our hand, Gamblers and Professor Oak will work well for us. If, by the grace of Arceus, you manage to get all 4 Imposter Professor Oaks in your hand, you can play all 4 at once, immediately forcing our opponent to draw and then discard 28 cards from their deck. At this point, if we were facing a real-life opponent, we could see the anguish dawn upon their face as they realized what was unfolding before them. Unfortunately, the Pokemon trading card game video game for Nintendo Game Boy does not have the dynamic facial expression technology required for me to savor such emotions. In substitute, I was forced to keep a folder with pictures of crying children on standby to approximate the experience during my playthrough. I can only hope that Nintendo will address this shortcoming in future additions to the series. But now that our opponent is down to their last 17 cards, we want to play any recycles and item finders we have left in order to retrieve our Imposter Professor Oaks from our discard pile. Should we lack the tools we need to continue our bullying of the absolute fool who dare opposed us, we can use any remaining Professor Oaks, gamblers, computer searches, and bills until we get the cards that we need to continue our dismantlement. Once you have a recycle in your hand, use that shit, flip a coin. If heads, you get to take an Imposter Professor Oak out of your discard pile and put it right on top of your deck. If we get 2 of these cards back and have a bill, we can use the bill to draw 2 additional Imposter Professor Oaks from our deck and add them directly into our hand. We can then play them again immediately, forcing another 14 cards to be drawn by our opponent. At this point, your opponent has just 5 cards left in the deck and the fear of God in their heart. If you have any item finders and 2 cards you don't need, you can use these to retrieve our sus-looking friend from our discard pile as well. If we can play a 7th Imposter Professor Oak, that's it. Our opponent will be forced to draw more cards than they have available in their deck, giving us the victory without ever having to stoop so low as to rely on a fucking lettuce frog. But before I could start exploiting this card game for 3rd graders, I needed the cards to pull it off, and as it turns out, our protagonist is a casual ass bitch who only has 30 cards to his name. Thankfully, the professor is a cool dude and willing to give us the 30 cards we need for a full deck. And these aren't just some trash cards he had lying around in his bulk pile. He gives us the choice between a Blastoise, Venusaur, and Charizard deck. Now I know how popular Charizard is, and who can deny the allure of a true friend who can keep you warm at that cold, lonely lunch table? And I know almost every kid went with the Charizard deck, but that just goes to prove that children are weak, foolish, and unlike me, a 30-year-old man, do not understand the meta of the Pokemon trading card game video game for Nintendo Game Boy. In order to get the cards we need to build our Imposter Professor Oak deck, just like in real life, we will need booster packs of new cards. Unlike real life, the only thing we need to spend in order to get these booster packs is our time. For you see, every time we defeat an opponent, we receive 2 additional booster packs as a reward, with different types of booster packs coming from different trainers. Colosseum packs contain the Professor Oak, Bill, and Computer Search. These booster packs are the common trash that you are rewarded for beating low-level trainers. The laboratory packs, however, these are that good stuff. They contain the Imposter Professor Oak, Recycle, Gambler, and Item Finder cards that we truly need to make our deck come to life. In order to earn these most sacred of packs, we will need to defeat a card club leader. The easiest leaders available to us at the beginning of the game are the Rock and Water leaders, both of whom have decks with a weakness to Leaf. Because of this, I chose Venusaur. Venusaur in hand, the grind began. I'm not going to go over the play-by-play here, but the pull rates for these particular cards I'm looking for is Not good. It's bad, actually. It's quite bad. This took a while. However, after about 10 hours of beating up these two women... But after about 10 hours of beating these two women at a children's card game and forcing them to buy a child $2,000 worth of booster packs, I had my cards. The Imposter Professor Oak deck was in place, and it was time to tear this world apart and lay claim to the legendary Pokemon cards. Wait, now's an important time to mention I was born in the 1990s when advertisements were full of edge. My heart was still full of hope, and the water was full of microplastics. Now water still has microplastics in it today, along with our food, our clothes, the land we live on, plants, animals, and even the air we breathe has trace amounts. But what I'm trying to say is that the water had microplastics back then too. I only bring this up because apparently at some point in the last 28 years, the plastics have begun to penetrate my brain-blood barrier and replace large swaths of my prefrontal cortex, robbing me of my ability to read properly. Because it turns out, Imposter Professor Oak does not force your opponent to discard their hand and draw 7 cards, it forces your opponent to shuffle their hand into their deck and draw 7 cards. I had just spent 10 hours grinding booster packs off the same 2 trainers to build a deck that doesn't actually do anything. I needed a new strategy, something fast, something effective, something that was so simple that someone with even brain damage could use it, because at this point I was starting to get pretty thirsty and that bottle of water on my desk was looking pretty appealing. Executor deck, yeah, let's go with that. Executor deck. So Executor is an attack where for every energy attached to him, you can flip a coin and do 20 damage to each heads. The trick here is that unlike most moves, there's no cap on how many energies you can attach here, so we can just focus on attaching as many energies as possible to Executor and then one-shot the entire opposing team. All the cards that help me search my deck and draw faster are still good here, and double colorless energy is a great addition because it counts as 2 energies, meaning 2 coin flips for the cost of 1 card. I also kept a Venusaur in my deck since it lets me move grass energies freely between grass Pokemon and serves as a great backup in case Executor gets executed. I was able to plow through all 7 of the remaining clubs with absolutely no challenge. I thought I would run into some trouble at the Fire Club and have to adapt, but the leader here was mostly using normal types for some reason. He did pull out a Growlithe once, but just like a real dog, it didn't use any fire moves on me. So Executor was just able to put this pupper down. Now if you've ever played a Pokemon game before, you know how this ends. It's time to face the Elite Four. Just like the main series, you face off against 4 trainers back to back. If you lose a single match, you have to restart, but thanks to my game knowledge and natural skill, I knew this wouldn't be an issue here. First up was Courtney, the easiest member of the Elite Four. Like every other Pokemon game, the first member of the Elite Four is more of a warm-up than an actual challenge. So I went about setting up my usual Executor strategy, and she crushed me, absolutely crushed me. It wasn't even close. She embarrassed me in front of the whole Elite Four, and then their assistant or whatever was just like, wow, you lost to Courtney? I'm gonna have to ask you to leave, sir. You see, the problem here isn't that I'm bad or anything. The issue is that Courtney knows that she's a joke of a trainer, a stain on the honor of the Elite Four. So to compensate for her lack of skill, she cheats by using Fire-type Pokemon that my Pokemon are weak to, and unlike the Fire Club leader, her Pokemon actually use attacks, which my deck of grass Pokemon just can't handle. At this point, it became clear I was going to have to adapt. I switched my deck out for a mix between water Pokemon, mostly Dugong who could hit Courtney's Pokemon for double damage, and Hitmonchan who had an attack that could do 20 damage with only 1 energy attached. Armed with the foreknowledge of all of my opponent's cards in a deck specially designed to counter her, it was time for a fair and even fight. I managed to defeat Courtney and reclaim my honor. And to thank my new team for redeeming me from this ultimate embarrassment, I put them back into my pile of bulk cards never to be touched again in favor of my good old Executor deck. Although, I guess this deck does have a 100% win rate. It couldn't hurt to keep using it, I suppose. Thankfully, the rest of the Elite Four doesn't have any Fire-type Pokemon for me to worry about, so Executor was back, and together we were unbeatable, unless of course I managed to miss 6 coin flips in a row at a pivotal moment. But what are the chances of that happening? After defeating all 4 members of the Elite Four in a row using the power of my skill and no cheating, we are finally rewarded with the legendary Pokemon cards. Except, we're not the first person to earn the right to wield the cards. Turns out our rival Ronald beat us here. And I'm just realizing I forgot to mention Ronald this entire time, but to be honest, I forgot he existed until I got to this part of the game. Quick recap, he shows up twice through the whole game before this point, and honestly isn't any more difficult than any of the other trainers in the game. But now things are different. He has the legendary god cards and he's going to fight us to keep them. One of these cards, a Moltres, is pretty terrifying with its potential damage output, but I guess I got lucky or something because it never attacked me. No, his true weapon was a mix of energy cards and his Dragonair that could remove one energy card from your active Pokemon every single turn. Since my entire deck relied on giving Executor more energies than a fucking power plant, that means if Ronald is lucky enough to draw multiple energy drains and get his Dragonair into play, he can completely shut down my deck. This makes this final battle a race to see who can set up their strategy first, but after 15 hours of careful planning and preparation, I was confident that I could beat him to the punch and claim the legendary Pokemon cards for myself. And finally, after hours of meticulous calculation and planning, I defeated my rival and became the Pokemon trading card game champion. Ronald loses his god card privileges and then literally sprints out the door in shame. And honestly, I don't blame him. He did just lose to the guy who lost to Courtney, so that's fair. Finally, I'm allowed to lay claim to the legendary Pokemon cards, so I walk up to them and they speak to me. Now, Sapien Pokemon cards have some pretty serious lore implications on the world of the Pokemon trading card game video game for Nintendo Game Boy. Are all the cards living, or just these cards? Why can they talk? Did they come into existence in 1998 with the rest of the trading cards? Or do the cards predate this game? Is the trading card game some sort of a ritual? Will they sit with me at lunch? Nintendo knew we would have questions, so to avoid answering them, the game just kind of ends right there. And honestly, that's a pretty good idea.